The room smelled like money and contempt. That was the first thing Stewart Garvey noticed when he wheeled his cart through the glass doors of the Calgary Energy Innovation Expo. The particular combination of expensive cologne, fresh carpet, and the quiet arrogance of people who had never once built anything with their hands. The expo hall stretched out before him like a cathedral dedicated to sleek surfaces and polished presentations. Every booth was a monument to corporate design budgets, backlit panels, touchscreen demonstrations, models in blazers handing out branded water bottles. The kind of event where everything looked like it had already been approved by 17 committees. Stewart's cart had a squeaky left wheel. He'd taped a handwritten sign to the front of his display table. Garvey Thermal Systems, Independent Research, Calgary, AB. The letters were slightly uneven because he'd written them at 6 in the morning before his coffee had properly kicked in. His daughter Bree had offered to print something nicer the night before, but he'd told her not to bother. People buy what works, he'd said, not what looks good on a banner. Bree had given him the look she'd been perfecting since she was 11 years old, the one that said, "Dad, you are going to embarrass yourself," but she'd hugged him anyway and told him to call her the moment anything happened. He set up his table in the corner assigned to independent inventors, Section F, far from the entrance, far from the catering, close to the emergency exit. The organizers had put 6 small-time exhibitors back there, hemmed in by a pipe-and-drape curtain that separated them from the main floor like a polite form of exile. His neighbors were a man selling biodegradable packaging who kept nervously rearranging his samples, and a retired schoolteacher from Red Deer who had designed a solar-powered greenhouse kit and had brought her own folding chair and a thermos of tea. Stewart liked her immediately. Her name was Evelyn Marsh, and she had the calm of a woman who had spent 40 years managing 8-year-olds and therefore feared nothing. She looked at Stewart's equipment, the compact thermal recovery unit he'd spent 3 years building in his garage in Okotoks, the binders of test data stacked beside it, the hand-drawn schematics he'd laminated himself, and she said simply, "That's a serious piece of work. Hope someone agrees with you." Stewart said, he had come to this expo with a straightforward purpose. He needed a licensing partner, or an investor, or at minimum someone with enough engineering knowledge to understand what he was looking at. His thermal recovery unit captured waste heat from industrial equipment, pumps, compressors, generators, and converted it back into usable electricity with an efficiency rate that, according to his testing data, was roughly 31% better than anything currently on the market. He had built the prototype from salvaged components, industrial surplus, and about 2,000 hours of evenings and weekends. His hands showed it. The knuckles on his right hand had a permanent callus from the torque wrench he'd used to rebuild the compression housing 4 times before he got it right. He was 53 years old. He had spent 22 years as a mechanical engineer for an oil and gas firm in Calgary before the industry restructuring in 2019 had eliminated his position along with 300 others. He had taken the severance, paid off what he could, and then done something his former colleagues thought was either brave or delusional. He had gone into his garage and started building, not because he had a business plan, not because he had investors lined up, because he had seen over 2 decades of fieldwork exactly how much energy the oil and gas sector hemorrhaged as waste heat every single day. Billions of dollars worth, vanishing into the air, and he had never been able to stop thinking about it. His ex-wife Linda had been patient about it for a long time, longer than most people would have been. But the garage had gradually consumed the evenings, then the weekends, then the conversations at dinner, and eventually she had sat him down and told him, with more kindness than he probably deserved, that she couldn't keep living in a house where the primary relationship was between a man and a heat exchanger. They had separated 2 years ago. It had been sad and civil and honest in the way that only long marriages ending can be. His son Trevor, 26, worked in Edmonton and called every Sunday. His daughter Bree, 23, lived 20 minutes away and showed up unannounced with groceries when she thought he was forgetting to eat. Which he was sometimes. He had a tendency to get absorbed. By 9:30 in the morning, the expo floor was filling up. The big players had taken the prime real estate near the entrance, a Montreal-based clean energy firm with a display the size of a small apartment, a tech company from Vancouver demonstrating a grid management software platform, and directly visible from Stewart's corner across the main floor, the booth for Vantech Industrial Solutions, one of the largest energy technology companies in Western Canada. Stewart knew Vantech's name well. Everyone in his former industry did. They were a $13 billion company with operations across 4 provinces, and a reputation for acquiring promising technology and then sitting on it until the competition died. Their CEO was a man named Randall Forsyth, who was, at this particular moment, standing at the Vantec booth in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Stewart's monthly mortgage payment, holding a glass of sparkling water and looking out over the expo floor with the proprietary satisfaction of a man surveying something he already owned. Stewart had read about Forsyth. He was the kind of executive who showed up at industry events not to learn anything but to be seen. He had a talent for memorable quotes and had been profiled in Report on Business magazine twice in the past 3 years. In the most recent profile, he had said, "Innovation in this sector doesn't come from garages. It comes from the kind of sustained capital investment that only established players can provide." The line had irritated Stewart enough that he had clipped it from the magazine and taped it inside his garage above his workbench, not as inspiration, as fuel. The morning passed quietly in Section F. A few attendees drifted back to look at the independent exhibitors, mostly out of curiosity. Evelyn gave her greenhouse pitch to a small group of agricultural representatives and answered their questions with the methodical patience of someone who had explained photosynthesis to children for 4 decades. The biodegradable packaging man handed out samples. Stewart talked to 3 people: a graduate student writing a thesis on waste energy recovery, a retired petroleum engineer from Lethbridge who asked several very good technical questions and then said sadly that he was just here attending, not representing anyone, and a young woman from a mid-sized Calgary engineering firm who took his card and said she'd pass it along. He didn't let himself feel discouraged. He had learned, over 3 years of building and refining and submitting applications and getting politely rejected, that discouragement was a luxury he couldn't afford. He drank his coffee from his thermos and reviewed his data binders and waited. At 11:15 things changed. The shift started with a small disturbance on the other side of the floor, a cluster of people moving together with the purposeful drift of a school of fish, trailing the unmistakable gravity of someone important. Randall Forsyth was making his lap of the expo, flanked by 2 assistants and trailed by what appeared to be a junior journalist from an industry publication. He moved through the big booths with practiced efficiency, exchanging handshakes and delivering compliments that meant nothing. Then, because the universe has a particular sense of humor, the group's trajectory brought them around the edge of the main floor and into Section F. Forsyth slowed when he saw Evelyn's greenhouse kit. He smiled at it the way someone smiles at a child's drawing. Then he moved to Stewart's table. He looked at the thermal recovery unit for a long moment. It was compact, about the size of a large microwave oven, constructed from a combination of machined aluminum and salvaged steel, with the pressure gauges and connection ports arranged in a configuration that made sense to anyone who understood how it worked but looked, to the uninitiated, like organized chaos. The laminated schematics beside it were dense with calculation. The binders of testing data were thick. Forsyth picked up one of Stewart's information sheets. He read the headline, 31% efficiency improvement over current thermal recovery standards, and made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Did you build this yourself?" he asked. He was looking at the unit, not at Stewart. "I did," Stewart said. "In a garage somewhere? In Okotoks, yes." Forsyth set the information sheet back down. He looked at Stewart then, really looked at him, the work boots, the worn jacket, the calloused hands, and something shifted in his expression. Not cruelty exactly, more like the reflexive dismissal of a man who had spent so long surrounded by scale that he'd lost the ability to recognize anything small as real. "I appreciate the ingenuity," Forsyth said in the tone of a man who did not appreciate it at all. "But this kind of hobbyist engineering, it doesn't translate. The certification requirements alone would cost more than this thing is worth. And 31% improvement is a bold claim for something built in a garage." He smiled pleasantly. "You'd want peer review before you start throwing numbers like that around at an event like this." His 2 assistants made the same small, polite, meaningless smiles. Stewart kept his voice level. He had thought, in the weeks before the expo, about how he would handle a moment like this. He had rehearsed several responses. In the end, he said only, "The testing data is in the binders. Independent lab verification from the University of Calgary. You're welcome to review it." Forsyth glanced at the binders the way a man glances at a door he has no intention of opening. "I'll leave that to the enthusiasts," he said, and moved on. The journalist, trailing behind, had written something in her notebook. Stewart couldn't see what. He stood at his table for a moment after they left, aware of Evelyn Marsh looking at him from 3 feet away with an expression of quiet, fierce solidarity. She poured tea from her thermos into a spare cup and set it on the corner of his table without saying anything. He nodded his thanks and drank it. He did not call Bree. He had told himself he would only call her when something happened, and what had just occurred was not something happening. It was just a man with bad manners and a good suit. What happened next took about 4 hours to build and approximately 11 minutes to detonate. At 1:30, a pair of attendees from the morning, the graduate student and, unexpectedly, a woman she'd apparently been talking to at lunch, who turned out to be a senior research director from a federal energy innovation fund based in Ottawa, came back to Section F to ask Stewart more questions about his testing methodology. The research director, a precise and unhurried woman named Dr. Patricia Ewing, spent 45 minutes going through his data binders with the focused attention of someone who was actually reading them. She asked 17 questions. Stewart answered all 17 without hesitation, because he had lived inside this data for 3 years and knew every number the way a carpenter knows the grain of wood. Dr. Ewing thanked him, took 2 copies of his technical summary, and left without indicating what, if anything, she intended to do with the information. At 2:45, a man in a navy blazer came back to Stewart's table and introduced himself as Neil Baxter. He was a partner at a Calgary-based clean energy investment firm. He said he'd heard about Stewart's unit from someone he'd had lunch with and had come to take a look. He spent 20 minutes asking questions about scalability, manufacturing cost, and market application. Then he asked if Stewart had legal protection on the design. Patent pending, Stewart said, filed 18 months ago. Neil Baxter nodded slowly. He said he'd need to make a call. At 3:15, the Expo's afternoon session began, which included a 40-minute showcase event on the main stage, an open forum where exhibitors could present briefly to the assembled attendees. Stewart had signed up for this in January when he registered, had been assigned a 6-minute slot, and had almost talked himself out of showing up for it 3 separate times in the preceding week. He went up anyway. He stood at the podium with his 1 laminated data chart and his 6 minutes, and he said exactly what the unit did, how it did it, what the testing had shown, and what he believed it could mean for industrial energy recovery in Canada. He didn't use the word revolutionary. He didn't make promises. He gave numbers and let the numbers speak, because numbers, in his experience, either told the truth or they didn't, and his did. He sat down to polite applause. Randall Forsyth, in the front row of the audience at the invitation of the organizers, did not applaud. He was looking at his phone. At 4:03, everything changed. Neil Baxter came back to Section F, this time with another man, older, heavier, moving with the unhurried authority of someone accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around him. He introduced himself as Robert Cheng. He was, he explained, a managing partner at a Vancouver-based infrastructure fund with significant holdings in the Canadian energy sector. He had been at the presentation. He had also, it emerged, spent the past 40 minutes on the phone with 2 engineers at his firm's technical office in Toronto, who had reviewed the publicly available information on Stewart's patent application. Robert Cheng did not ask many questions. He asked 5. They were the 5 most essential questions about the technology, and he asked them in sequence with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Then he was quiet for a moment, looking at the unit. "What are you looking for?" he said finally. Stewart had thought about this answer too. He said, "A licensing agreement with a manufacturer who has the production capacity to bring this to market, or a partnership structure that preserves my involvement in the technical development. I'm not looking to sell and walk away." Robert Cheng looked at Neil Baxter. Neil Baxter looked back. "We may be interested in something along those lines," Cheng said. "But I want our lead engineer to see this in person before we go further. Can you have the unit available for a technical review next week?" "Yes," Stewart said. "Good." Cheng took out a card and set it on the table. "We'll be in touch by Friday." They left. Stewart stood at his table in the corner of Section F with the card in his hand and the squeaky-wheeled cart behind him, and Evelyn Marsh watching him with the expression of someone who has seen a very satisfying thing happen to a deserving person. "Well," Evelyn said, "there we are." What happened next Stewart would describe to Bree later that night on the phone, his voice coming out slightly unsteady in a way he hadn't anticipated, as one of those moments where the floor kind of shifts under you without moving. Because at 4:22, Dr. Patricia Ewing came back. She did not come back alone. She came back with a colleague, a man she introduced as Senior Program Director for the National Industrial Efficiency Initiative, a federal program Stewart had applied to twice and been rejected from both times. He introduced himself as Gordon, not his full name, he explained. Everyone just called him Gordon, and he shook Stewart's hand with the firmness of someone delivering good news. The federal program, Gordon explained, had been restructured earlier that year with a significantly expanded mandate and budget. Dr. Ewing had flagged Stewart's application as a candidate for reconsideration under the new framework. They could not make commitments at an expo, of course, but they wanted to extend a formal invitation for Stewart to present before the program's technical review panel in Ottawa in 6 weeks. "We're particularly interested," Gordon said, looking at the unit, "in the scalability data. If the efficiency numbers hold at industrial scale, this has implications beyond what you might have originally designed it for. After they left, Stewart sat down. He sat in the folding chair he'd brought from home and looked at the 2 business cards on his table and the binders of data and the unit he'd built from salvaged parts in a garage in Okotoks over 3 years of evenings, and he let himself feel, for the first time in a long time, something uncomplicated. Evelyn poured him more tea. He drank it. At 4:50, with the expo winding down and exhibitors starting to pack up, Randall Forsyth made his second pass through Section F. It was not clear if he had intended to stop at Stewart's table or if his feet had simply brought him there on the way to the exit. He stopped. He looked at the 2 business cards on the table. He was close enough to read the names on them. His expression did not collapse or crumble. He was too practiced for that, but something in it recalibrated. A small, almost invisible recalculation. Cheng Capital, he said. It came out as neither a question nor a statement, just a recognition. He wants a technical review next week, Stewart said. Forsyth was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, he kept his voice professionally even, which took visible effort. I may have been hasty this morning, he said. If you're open to it, I'd like to have our technical team take a look as well before you commit to anything. Stewart looked at him for a long moment. He thought about the information sheet Forsyth had set back down without finishing. He thought about hobbyist engineering and peer review and the pleasant, dismissive smile. He thought about the profile and report on business and the clipping above his workbench. He thought about 22 years in the field watching energy vanish into the air. He said, "Send your team's credentials and a formal letter of interest to my email address. It's on the card." He handed Forsyth one of his handmade information sheets. Forsyth took it. He left without another word, and Stewart watched him go, and then turned back to packing up his table with the methodical care he brought to all things, folding the schematics, organizing the binders, wrapping the unit carefully in the moving blanket he'd brought from home. Evelyn was folding up her own display nearby. "You know," she said without looking up, "I think I'm going to come back next year." "Good idea," Stewart said. He called Bree from the parking lot, standing beside his truck in the early evening, the Calgary skyline going orange behind the Rockies. She picked up on the second ring. "Dad, what happened?" It wasn't a question. She knew him well enough to hear it in his voice before he said a word. He told her. He told her about Forsyth in the morning and the comment about garages and hobbyists. He told her about Dr. Ewing reading through all 17 pages of the data and asking 17 questions. He told her about Neil Baxter and Robert Cheng and the invitation to Ottawa. He told her about Forsyth coming back at the end of the day with different eyes. Bree was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dad, yeah, I told you to let me print a nicer sign." He laughed. It came out louder than he expected there in the parking lot, loud enough that a man loading equipment into a van nearby glanced over. "Yeah," he said, "next time." He drove home to Okotoks in the fading light. The garage door was still unlocked from the morning. He'd left in a hurry, and he went in before he went into the house, the way he always did, and he stood for a moment in the familiar smell of machine oil and metal and the particular dusty warmth of a space where a lot of hours had been spent thinking. The clipping was still above the workbench. Innovation in this sector doesn't come from garages. He left it there. He figured he'd keep it a while longer.